My name is Miguel. I've dedicated my entire life to working from dawn to dusk, believing that every drop of sweat, every sleepless night, every sacrifice had a purpose, to ensure my family had what I never had. While my friends sought rest and fun, I sought sustenance. While many rested on holidays, I was working with calloused hands, carrying heavy loads, enduring rain and strong sun. And that's how I built not just a home, but also a lifetime of silent dedication. Clara, my wife, always said I had too big a heart to deny my children anything. I told her I lived for them, that everything I did was so that one day they could look back and be proud of the father they had. But the time came when my strength was no longer what it once was. The hands that had once built walls began to tremble. The legs that had walked miles every day lost their strength. My body, tired from so many battles, begged for rest. I believed it was time to receive for the first time some of the care I had so generously offered. It was then that I heard the cruelest words anyone could receive from their own children. That night, sitting at the table, I tried to share a memory, a piece of advice. My son looked me in the eye and said coldly, "An old man like you is no good anymore." The sentence fell upon me like a death sentence. The silence of the others only confirmed it. They agreed. The next day I woke up and realized it wasn't just a phrase spoken in the heat of the moment. It was a decision. I was left aside, forgotten. They treated me like a weight, a burden, and little by little, I began to feel like they were just waiting for the day I was no longer there. I was left alone, as if my entire life had lost its value, as if I were just an unimportant shadow. But what they didn't know is that my story wouldn't end there. Because after being thrown into the shadows, I found a light that changed everything. From a young age, I learned that life wouldn't give you anything for free. My father left too soon, and my mother, alone, could barely put food on the table. I grew up working, carrying firewood, helping with crops, cleaning neighbors' yards. I never knew the luxuries of childhood, but I learned early the value of responsibility. When I met Clara, my wife, I promised her that as long as I had the strength, I would never let anything be lacking in our home. And so it was. I worked as a bricklayer, a helper, a doorman, a gardener, whatever came my way. My hands, calloused and scarred, were the tools that provided my daily bread. I remember the night our first son was born. I was exhausted after a full day of work, but when I held him in my arms, I felt a strength I'd never felt before. It was as if the weight of the world had lifted. I knew I would do anything for him. And then came the other children, and with them, more responsibilities, but also more reasons to fight. I spent decades like this. If someone needed new shoes, I was the first to give up mine. If school required supplies, I worked overtime. If someone got sick, I was the one who spent sleepless nights caring for them, praying, and scrambling for medicine. There was no sacrifice too great when it came to my family. Many told me I was too good, that perhaps I was foolish for not thinking of myself. But I smiled and replied, "My reward is to see them grow." And so it went. For years, I built not just a house, but a home filled with memories. Clara cooking on the wood stove, the children running around the yard, winter nights when everyone would huddle around the fire while I told stories. All I wanted was this, for my family to have what I never had. And for a long time I believed that this love would be reciprocated. But growing old proved to be a greater trial than I could have imagined. Because when my strength began to fail, I realized that those I fought the most for no longer saw any value in me. The first signs of rejection didn't come as shouts or direct accusations. They came as small, almost imperceptible gestures, but they slowly began to corrode my heart. At first it was impatient looks when I took too long to get up from my chair, or loose comments that seemed like jokes but carried venom. "The old man can't keep up anymore. Leave it alone, Dad, you're just getting in the way." I smiled, pretending not to care, but inside I felt the wound opening. One night, while trying to help set the table, I accidentally dropped a plate. The sound of the glass breaking still echoes in my memory. My daughter-in-law sighed loudly and said, "That's why I say he only complicates things, better to leave it alone." My son didn't defend me. He just remained silent, as if he agreed. I picked up the pieces in silence, feeling that I was slowly becoming a stranger in my own home. I also began to realize that my stories were no longer welcome. Before, my children and grandchildren would gather to hear about our working days, about how Clara and I built our lives from nothing. But now when I started talking, they'd change the subject or get up from the table. I'd stay with the words stuck in my throat, staring at my plates, pretending not to notice the disdain. Little by little, they began making decisions without consulting me. They moved furniture around, sold my things, organized get-togethers, and I only found out later. I was no longer included, no longer listened to. He was just someone taking up space. The hardest blow came one Sunday morning. I was sitting on the porch tending the plants I'd planted years ago when I heard something from inside the house that froze my heart. One of my children said, loud enough for me to hear, "He's no good anymore. He's just another mouth to feed." I stood still. The wind blew on my face, but the cold I felt came from within. It was the beginning of a cruel sentence, one that would later become explicit. I, Miguel, who had given everything I had, was being reduced to nothing more than a burden. As the months passed, what had previously been mere murmurs turned into open humiliations. There was no longer any effort to hide it. The contempt they felt for me began to be spoken aloud, in front of everyone, as if there was no longer any respect to maintain. I remember a Sunday lunch. The table was laden, the plates full, the children running around. I sat in the corner, happy just to be there. When I reached for a piece of meat, my daughter-in-law was quicker. She removed the platter and said with a cold smile, "Leave it to the younger ones, Miguel. You don't need much." Everyone laughed, except me. I stood there, my hand suspended in the air, feeling shame burn on my face. I slowly curled my fingers, lowered my head, and silently chewed what little was on my plate. Another time, when I tried to give my son advice on how to fix the backyard fence, he laughed out loud, shaking his head. "Father, you don't understand these things anymore. It's way past your time. Let me sort it out." The words weren't just a refusal. They were a warning. I no longer had a voice in that house. The worst was one winter night. The fire was burning in the fireplace, and everyone was gathered in the living room. I went over to warm myself, but before I could sit down, I heard, "Leave room for others, Father. You are always in the middle." I stood in the corner, watching the flames from afar. With each crackle of the burning wood, it felt like something inside me was also breaking apart. These scenes repeated themselves one after the other, and each one ripped away a shred of my dignity. The home I had built with so much sacrifice had become a place of exile. I was surrounded by people, but more alone than ever. And what had previously been just jokes or veiled messages now became clear. They no longer saw me as part of the family, but as a nuisance to be removed. It was during this period that I painfully realized they no longer saw me as a father. I was no longer the man who built every wall of that house, the tireless worker who spent sleepless nights ensuring everything was prepared. To them, I was just a tired body, an old man taking up space. One day I woke up early and heard a conversation coming from the kitchen. I couldn't resist and stayed behind the door, silent. It was my youngest son, talking to his wife. "He's no longer any use. He's just a hassle. We need to think about what to do." Those words hit me like a punch in the gut. Was I no longer good for anything? I, who had given every year of my youth, every drop of sweat, every sleepless night. At that moment, I realized that I was no longer seen as a father, but as a burden. A few days later, the scene repeated itself, but this time at the table in front of everyone. I tried to join in the conversation, recalling an old story, and before I could finish, one of them interrupted me with a wry smile. "Leave it alone, Dad. You always repeat the same stories. It's getting tiresome." The silence that followed was crueler than any scream. No one defended me. No one said a word in my favor. I stood there, my mouth half open, feeling shame engulf me. What hurt me most wasn't just the words, but the looks. Looks of impatience, of irritation, as if my mere presence were an inconvenience. Even my grandchildren, unable to grasp the gravity of it, began repeating phrases they heard. "Grandpa just gets in the way." I smiled in front of them so as not to scare them, but inside my heart broke. And it was during this period that I began to understand a cruel truth. I was no longer seen as a father, as a grandfather, as a man. I was seen as nothing. And the sentence that would one day be said aloud was already written in the gestures. An old man like you is no good anymore. The decisive moment arrived on a gray afternoon, the kind where the wind blows cold, even indoors. I was sitting on the porch, looking out at the backyard where my children once ran around as toddlers. The memories came flooding back. Clara laughing as she hung clothes on the line, the kids fighting over the swing, me coming home from work with fresh bread for everyone. It was the backdrop to the life I'd built with my own hands. It was then that I heard voices inside the house. They weren't whispers. It was an open, loud conversation, with no thought of sparing me. I recognized the voice of my youngest son saying, "He's no longer useful. We can't live carrying someone who's no longer useful." The words echoed like hammer blows in my chest. Before I could react, another replied, "It's hard, but it's true. He's already lived what he had to live. Now he's just getting in the way." The pain I felt was indescribable. These weren't strangers saying this. They were my own children, the same ones I'd worked for until my hands bled, the same ones I'd starve so they'd never go hungry. Late in the afternoon, when I entered the room, I felt the weight of cold stares. No invitation to sit down, no kind words, just silence and indifference. The next day, I woke up to find my plate already removed from the table, set aside, as if my presence was no longer welcome in the same space. When I questioned her, I received only a curt response from my daughter-in-law. "It's better this way." The message was clear. I was an intruder. That night, alone in my room, I cried like a child. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had been condemned to oblivion. Not as someone who grows old with dignity, but as someone who is discarded. The cruel words I heard echoed endlessly. "An old man like you is no good anymore." It was there that I realized that the pain of abandonment isn't just physical. It's a slow death of the soul. But it was also there that a flame began to burn, still small inside me, because I knew my story couldn't end like this. After that night of crying alone in my room, I felt something inside me change. The pain was great, but there was also a different restlessness, as if a soft voice were telling me, "You can't accept dying like this, erased, as if you never existed." I got up early, wiped my eyes, and began rummaging through my things. I opened the old trunk at the back of the closet full of yellowed papers and objects forgotten by time. There were fragments of my story, proof that I wasn't useless, that every part of my life had value. I took the deed to the house in my hand, in my name. I remembered proudly signing that document, even though my hands were shaking with fatigue. I also found receipts for school payments, electricity bills, and medicine. Each page was a silent testament to years of sacrifice. But what struck me most was an old photograph. Clara, smiling, holding our first baby son, in front of the house under construction. Me, barefoot, covered in dust, but with my heart full of hope. Looking at that photo brought tears back. But this time not of defeat, but of vivid memory of the man I once was. I then decided to organize everything in a blue folder, the same one Clara had given me years ago to store important documents. Inside I put the deed, receipts, photos, and a black-covered notebook. In this notebook I began writing my memories, as if it were a belated diary. I wrote about nights I didn't sleep to care for sick children, about days I worked twice as hard so there would never be a shortage of bread, about every sacrifice I made without complaining. As I wrote, I felt that each word was a way of regaining some of my dignity, as if I were saying to myself, "Miguel, you were never a burden. You were the foundation." I slammed the notebook shut, held the folder against my chest, and promised, "They'll have to listen." And for the first time in a long time, I went to bed that night feeling like there was still fight in me. In the days that followed, the blue folder always stayed by my side, as if it were an extension of my heart. Each time I opened it, it was as if Clara's voice whispered to me, "Don't let them erase your story, Miguel. You still have a lot to say." I began to rehearse words in silence. I sat on the edge of my bed, opened my black notebook, and read aloud as if I were standing in front of them. At first, my voice was shaky, choked with pain, but little by little, it gained strength. They were no longer phrases of despair, but declarations of someone who knew their own worth. "You said I was no longer good for anything, but I was the one who gave you everything you have today. You left me alone, but every wall in this house still bears the marks of my sweat. An old man like me may be tired, yes, but he is not useless, because the love I gave can never be erased. I also wrote letters, one to each child, not letters of spite, but of memory. In each, I described specific moments: the day I sold my watch to pay for Joan's medicine, the night I skipped dinner so Anna could have the new notebook she'd asked for, the day I carried cement on my back until I nearly passed out, just to finish the house in time for winter. The words in the letters were like mirrors. I wanted them to see as they read them, not just the father they rejected, but the man who sustained them. At night, in front of the mirror, I practiced my look. I didn't want to enter them angry, but I couldn't enter them as a victim either. I needed my voice to be that of a dignified man, not one begging for mercy. That's when I decided I wouldn't wait any longer. At the next family gathering, when everyone was gathered, I would put the folder on the table and make them listen to me, whether they wanted to or not. And that night, before I went to sleep, I said a simple but sincere prayer. Lord, I don't want to humiliate anyone. I just want them to see who I was. Give me courage. I closed my eyes and fell asleep with a firm heart. I was no longer just an old reject. I was preparing myself for the moment when the truth would come out. The nights, which had previously been empty and silent, began to transform into a battlefield within my heart. I would lie there for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the cruel echo of that phrase, "An old man like you is no good anymore." It was like an open wound that insisted on bleeding. Sometimes resentment tried to take over. I imagined walking into the room and shouting back, telling them they were ungrateful, that they would never have gotten this far without me. My heart burned with rage, and for a moment it seemed like that was the only way, to pay them back in kind. But in the midst of these thoughts, something inside me said, if you follow this path, you will become like that which hurt you. That's when I started bending my knees every night. At first, my prayers were filled with pain. Lord, why did my children reject me? Why, after so much love, do I receive only contempt? I cried until I wet my pillow, but over time, my words began to change. They weren't just questions anymore. They were requests. Lord, don't let my heart harden. Don't let me drown in hatred. If I have to face them, let it be with the truth, but also with dignity. Each prayer seemed to strengthen me from the inside out. I would rise from the floor with tears still in my eyes, but also with a gentle peace, as if God were saying to me, you are not alone. I am still here. That's how I realized. My struggle wasn't just against my family's contempt. The real battle was against the resentment that was trying to dominate me. If I let it win, then I would truly be useless, because I would have lost the essence of what made me Miguel. That night, I wrote in my black notebook a sentence that would become my motto. I will not fight to destroy, I will fight to be remembered. Not for hate, but for the truth I have carried my entire life. I slammed the notebook shut, clutched the folder to my chest, and realized I was getting ready. After so many nights of prayer and reflection, I realized I couldn't wait indefinitely. The opportunity would come, and I needed to be ready. It was then that I heard from one of my grandchildren that the family would be gathering the following Sunday for lunch. Everyone would be present: sons, daughters-in-law, grandchildren. My heart raced in my chest. I felt fear, yes, but also a certainty. That would be the day. I spent the entire week preparing. I checked every document inside the blue folder: the house deed, photos of Clara with the young children, old receipts for bills I'd paid myself, even carefully kept notes that showed how I'd always been there. I also reviewed every word written in the black notebook, so that when my voice trembled, the pages would speak for me. But the preparation wasn't just about paperwork. It was about me. I practiced in front of the mirror, not to look angry, but to make my eyes look firm. I repeated phrases until I memorized them. You said I was no longer useful, but I was the one who gave you every inch of ground you walk on. You left me alone, but the love I gave lives on because it cannot be erased. Each rehearsal was a mixture of pain and strength. I didn't want to enter that room as a victim nor as an avenger. I wanted to enter as Miguel, the man who was a father, husband, and worker, and who deserved to be recognized for it. The night before, I could barely sleep. I stared at the ceiling, remembering Clara. I closed my eyes and could almost hear her voice. Miguel, don't be afraid. The truth is your strength. Go and speak. They need to hear it. At dawn, I put on my best outfit, the same one I wore on my 50th wedding anniversary. I ran my hands through my white hair, took a deep breath, and looked at the folder on my desk. This wasn't just a collection of papers. It was my life. I held her against my chest and said in a low voice, "Lord, tomorrow is not the day of revenge. It is the day of truth. Walk with me." And so, I prepared my heart for the confrontation that would change everything. Sunday arrived with a gray, heavy sky, as if even nature shared the weight I carried in my chest. I woke before sunrise, washed my face, and stood in front of the mirror for a few minutes. The reflection showed an aged man with hunched shoulders and hands marked by time, but his eyes were different. There was no longer just sadness. There was determination. I picked up the blue folder and ran my fingers over its worn cover. Inside was everything: the documents, the photos, the letters, and the black notebook. But more than that, there was my voice, gathered and ready to be heard. I held it tight to my chest and said a short but sincere prayer. "Lord, may it not be hatred but truth. May it not be revenge but justice. Give me courage." I put on the best outfit I still had. The shirt wasn't new, but it had been lovingly chosen by Clara for one of our birthdays. I wanted to carry it with me as a reminder that I wasn't alone, that she was still walking beside me in some way. On the way home, each step seemed to carry years of memories. I could picture my children still young running around the yard, Clara waiting for me at the gate with a tired but loving smile. Each memory hurt and strengthened me at the same time. When I arrived, I heard voices coming from inside. Laughter, conversation, the clinking of glasses and cutlery. It was the same sound that had so often brought me joy, but now it felt like a cruel reminder that I no longer belonged. I took a deep breath, walked slowly up the steps, and stopped in front of the door. I ran my hand over the doorknob and closed my eyes for a moment. My heart was pounding, but there was no turning back. I pushed the door open and walked in. Silence fell immediately. All eyes turned to me. I clutched the folder to my chest, walked to the table, and said, in the firm voice I had practiced so many times, "Today, you will listen to me." The silence that filled the room was almost suffocating. Glasses hung in the air, plates stopped halfway to their mouths. Everyone looked at me as if I were an intruder who had crossed a forbidden border. But this was my house. This was my home. And I would no longer allow myself to be treated like a stranger. I held the blue folder against my chest for a few seconds, feeling the weight not just of the papers, but of an entire life within. I walked to the table, cleared some dishes, and placed it on the white tablecloth with a sharp click that echoed through the room. João, my oldest son, who always tried to maintain control of the situation, was the first to break the silence. "Dad, what are you doing here?" I looked up and stared at him. My voice came out firm, stronger than I expected. "I'm here because this is still my home. Because I was the one who built every wall, who cooked every meal, who gave up my youth so that all of you could have what you have today." I lowered my hand onto the folder and continued, "And today, you will listen to me." I slowly opened the metal clasp, the sound cutting through the heavy air like a blade. I pulled out the first photograph. Clara smiling, holding baby João in her arms, while I, covered in dust, lifted the walls of the house in the background. I placed the photo in front of them. "This was our first victory, do you remember? Maybe not because you were too young, but I remember every detail. The still dirt floor, the unfinished walls, and the promise that there would never be a roof over your heads." Next, I pulled out some old, already yellowed receipts and spread them out on the table. "Here are the bills I paid when there was no money. Here are the medicines I bought when you were sick." Every page, every number is proof that a useless old man, as you called him, was once the foundation that kept everyone afloat. The silence grew even heavier. Anna lowered her eyes, biting her lip. João couldn't hold my gaze. I hugged the folder again and finished, looking everyone in the eye. "You told me I'm no longer good for anything. Well, today you'll have to face the truth. I've always been good. And without me, none of this would exist." I opened the black notebook with steady hands despite my racing heart. The yellowed pages were stained with sweat and tears, but they bore witness to a lifetime. I took a deep breath and began to read aloud, unhurriedly, letting each word sink in the silence of the room. July 8, 1985. I worked 16 hours carrying bags of cement. I returned home with bleeding hands, but with enough money to buy Joan's school shoes. I slept on the floor, exhausted but happy because he wouldn't have to go barefoot to school. I looked up. I saw Joan bite his lip, looking away. I continued. January 2nd, 1990. Clara fell ill. I didn't have enough money for all the medicine, so I ate only bread and water for 3 days to make sure there was enough left for her. I never told anyone, but I remember the empty feeling in my stomach as I watched everyone else eating at the table. A tear ran down my face, but my voice remained steady. March 14th, 1995. We sold our wedding rings to pay for school tuition. Clara cried, but smiled later, saying, "Gold rings can be bought again, but our children's education will never return." I closed the notebook for a moment and looked at them. Everyone was completely silent. The children, confused, looked at their parents. My daughter-in-law nervously wiped her eyes with her napkin. These pages are not made up. They are my life, written night after night while you slept, unaware that someone was awake, sustaining everything. You told me I was no longer useful, but without this useless old man, how many of these stories would you have lived? I opened the notebook again and tapped the pages lightly. It's all here. Every sacrifice, every tear, every surrender. You can try to erase it from memory, but you can't erase it from history. The room remained silent. I knew the first cracks in their pride had begun to appear. I turned a few more pages of the notebook, my hands shaking not from weakness, but from the weight of what I was about to reveal. I took a deep breath and began to read a passage I had kept silent for years. September 21st, 1998. The money ran out before the end of the month. The children needed milk. Clara and I went 2 whole days without eating so they could have at least a glass of milk every morning. I remember my stomach hurting, but I also remember their smiles. Clara told me, "One day they'll understand what we did for them." I believed it. I closed my eyes for a moment, swallowing the pain. When I looked again, the room was still. Joan was discreetly wiping his eyes. Anna stared at the floor, as if she didn't have the courage to look me in the eye. I continued now without reading, just letting the memories flow. I carried bags of cement until I nearly passed out so you'd never get cold. I sold what little I had, even wedding rings, so you could study. Clara and I stayed up all night, caring for you when you were sick, praying you'd survive. My voice rose, but not in anger, in pain. And after all this, after a lifetime, you told me I'm no longer good for anything. A heavy silence fell, broken only by my daughter-in-law's suppressed sob as she hid her face behind her napkin. My grandchildren looked on in confusion, tugging at their parents' sleeves as if silently asking, "Is all this true?" I raised the notebook in the air. This useless old man gave everything he had. And today before you I say, if I am no longer good for anything, then none of what you have today would have existed. I slammed the notebook shut, the dry sound echoing like a gavel. No one dared to answer. I clutched the notebook to my chest and instead of continuing to read, looked up to meet their gazes. The room felt more suffocating by the second, but I wouldn't back down. I looked first at Joan, the oldest. He had always been the most rigid, rarely showing his feelings. But now, sitting across from me, his hand trembled on his fork, unable to bear the weight of the silence. I pointed directly at him and said, "John, I sold my watch, the one I got at our wedding, to pay for your first medicine when you got sick. I worked non-stop for 3 days so I could bring you food when you had a fever and couldn't get out of bed. And now tell me, looking me in the eye, was it fair to say I'm no longer good for anything?" He tried to speak, but his voice faltered. He just shook his head, tears streaming down his face. I turned to Anna. "You, my daughter, remember when you wanted to go to college and we had no money? I worked double time in construction until my feet bled inside my boots. And when you walked into that classroom for the first time crying with happiness, I said to Clara, it was worth every effort. And now, Anna, was it worth it for you to see me being treated like a burden?" She couldn't resist. The tears flowed freely and she lowered her face into her hands, sobbing. Finally, I faced my daughter-in-law, who had so often looked at me with contempt. "And you said so many times that I was just a hindrance. But who paid the electricity bill when your husband didn't have a job yet? Who fixed every leak in the house without charging? Who kept food on the table while you two were getting back on your feet? Me, this useless old man. She brought her hands to her face, unable to look at me. My voice echoed firmly, breaking the silence. You may have left me alone, you may have made me believe my worth was gone. But today, before everyone, I say, I wasn't the one who failed you. It was you who forgot who I am. The silence that followed was absolute. All that could be heard was their suppressed crying and the sound of chairs creaking as they shifted restlessly. In that instant, I realized that the wall of pride they had built for years was beginning to crack. I remained silent for a few seconds, letting the weight of my words sink in. Then I opened the folder again and pulled out a folded envelope, unlike any other. It was the last letter I had written, not to a specific child, but to all of them. I held it in the air and said in a firm voice, "This letter is not an accusation. It's not to collect debts, nor is it merely a reminder of sacrifices. This letter is the summary of my life, and what you need to hear today." I opened it slowly, my hands shaking, and began to read. I spent my entire life believing that a man's greatest wealth is his family. I gave everything I had, my strength, my dreams, my body, my time. When they called me useless, it hurt more than any wound. But I didn't come here for revenge. I came to let you know that despite everything, I still love you. Because if they take everything from me, there remains something that no one can erase. The truth of my dedication. I looked up and continued, now without reading. You may have left me alone, you may have called me nothing, you may have condemned me to oblivion. But my story does not end here. I closed the letter and tapped it lightly on the table. Today you saw me as a frail old man, but what you don't know is that something bigger is happening. What comes after this, you could never imagine. The silence was cut by unshed tears. Some of my grandchildren hugged me, not fully understanding but feeling the weight of the moment. My children lowered their heads, embarrassed, unable to respond. I picked up the folder, held it against my chest, and said the final sentence, letting it echo in the room. You said I'm no longer good for anything, but the truth is that God isn't finished with me yet. And I walked away, leaving the letter on the table like a planted seed. At that moment I realized the real turning point was yet to come. When I returned to my room that night, the weight of the confrontation still burned within me. I had said everything, shown evidence, exposed memories, opened old wounds. My children cried. My daughters-in-law cowered in silence. My grandchildren hugged me. And yet, as I closed the door behind me, I realized something was still missing. I sat on the edge of the bed, the blue folder on my knees. I ran my hand over the worn cover and sighed deeply. I had shown them the truth, yes, but inside me a question still lingered. And now, the pain hadn't gone away. The phrase still echoed in my mind. An old man like you is no good anymore. I had proven the opposite to them, but inside me there was still the risk that this wound would turn into resentment. It was then, almost without realizing it, that I found myself on my knees on the cold bedroom floor. And for the first time in a long time, my words were not directed at my family, but at God. Lord, I don't know how to go on anymore. I've said everything I needed to, I've shown everything I kept inside, but my heart still aches. I don't want to carry hate. I don't want my life to end in bitterness. If you still have a purpose for me, show it to me. The tears fell uncontrollably, but suddenly something changed. There were no bright lights or audible voices. Just a gentle presence, a calm that began to fill my chest. The emptiness was filled with an inexplicable peace. At that moment, I felt as if Jesus was there, silently telling me, "You have always belonged to me. When they said you were useless, I already told them you were precious. When the world left you alone, I never left you." I cried like I hadn't cried in years, not from pain, but from liberation. For the first time since hearing those cruel words, I realized my worth didn't depend on what my children thought. I wasn't worthless. I was a child of God. I got up from the floor, my legs still shaking, but my heart light. And I understood. The true turning point in my story hadn't happened in the living room, in front of my family. It was happening there, in the silence of my room, in my encounter with Jesus. The next morning, I opened the window and let the sun shine in. The same room that had felt like a place of solitude the night before was now illuminated by a peace I couldn't explain. A weight had lifted from me. For the first time in years, I didn't wake up thinking about how to get revenge or how to prove my worth. I simply woke up knowing my worth was already secure, in Christ. As I sipped the simple coffee I'd made, I looked at the blue folder and the black notebook. They were still important, but now I saw them differently. Before, they were weapons of confrontation. Now they were witnesses to God's care in every stage of my life. Each sacrifice was not just a memory of pain, but a reminder that I was never alone, even when I thought I was. I sat down with my children again a few days later. The tension was still evident. Distrustful looks, heavy footsteps, short words. But I no longer held any resentment. Instead of opening the folder, I opened my heart. "Children," I began, my voice calm, "I've already said everything I needed to about the past. You know what I did. You know the price I paid. But today, I didn't come to talk about bills or documents. Today, I came to tell you that I've found peace." They looked at each other, confused. I continued. "That night, alone in my room, I knelt before God, and I discovered that it doesn't matter if the world says I'm worthless, because to Him, I still have a purpose." Silence filled the room. João squeezed his eyes shut as if trying to hold back tears. Ana placed her hand on her chest. My daughters-in-law looked at me in surprise, as if they couldn't understand how someone so hurt could speak with such serenity. "I didn't come to ask you for anything else," I concluded. "I came to offer what I found, forgiveness." Those words, so simple, fell like stones on their hearts. I saw in each of their eyes a mixture of shame and relief. It was as if the remaining wall of pride began to crumble before what they never expected to hear. That instead of resentment, I chose love. And in that instant I realized the miracle that Jesus had begun in me was already beginning to pour out upon my family. The silence that filled the room was different this time. It was no longer cold or contemptuous. It was shocking. Everyone looked at me as if they couldn't understand how, after so many wounds, I could speak of forgiveness. I took a deep breath, opened my arms, and said, "I don't want my last memories to be of resentment. I want them to be of reconciliation. I want you to know that despite everything that happened, I choose to forgive. Not because I'm strong, but because Jesus taught me that forgiveness is greater than pain." Ana was the first to get up. She came to me crying and threw herself into my arms. "Dad, I don't deserve this, but thank you. I promise I'll never leave you alone again." João soon followed, his eyes brimming with tears. He held my hands and, for the first time in years, let the tears flow unabashedly. "I have sinned against you, Father, but if there is still a chance, I want to be the son I never was." My daughters-in-law also approached. One of them said, sobbing, "Mr. Miguel, I was unfair, blinded by my own arrogance. You are not a burden, you are a pillar. I ask your forgiveness." My grandchildren, not understanding the depth, ran and hugged me by the legs, repeating, "We love you, Grandpa." At that moment, I realized the miracle was complete. The man who had been called worthless, discarded, and forgotten was now once again surrounded by loving arms. Not because my family had suddenly become perfect, but because God had touched each heart through forgiveness. I looked up at the ceiling, tears streaming down my face, and whispered silently, "Thank you, Lord. What pain destroyed, your love restored." And so my story, which seemed doomed to oblivion, gained a new chapter, not one of revenge, but of reconciliation. Because I learned that a man can be rejected by the whole world, but when he is welcomed by God, he can change even the most hardened heart.